We're running just a few moments fast. Welcome everyone to be a little bit patient as we wait for our last panelist. And I'll take a moment to wish everyone a happy Juneteenth.
I was going to say it's been actually a very overwhelming Juneteenth. Too much information. I'm inundated. And watching the film again is overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. Welcome, Aaron. So welcome back to those who were with us for the film screening, and welcome to those who are just joining us now. We're about to start our panel in just a moment, but first I wanted to tell you how the next hour will go. We have a few prepared questions that we will start with, but after those questions, we will open it up to questions. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you send those in the chat function. We'll have time for those after the panelists answer some prepared questions. Don't hesitate to put questions in the chat section as you have them. Be sure that you select chat everyone so that we are able to see your questions. We might not have time to get through all of the questions today, but that's why we hope that this will be the beginning of the discussion and you will continue this work with us after the session ends today. Look out for the email we send after the session with steps you can take to continue your advocacy. Now, I have the pleasure of welcoming our panelists. Reverend Andre Alexander is the Associate General Secretary for Action and Advocacy for Justice and Peace with the National Council of Churches. She leads the organization's priority to reverse the rising tide of mass incarceration in the United States and the NCC's Truth and Racial Equity Initiative, the Act Now to End Racism campaign. Seeks to join in truth-telling, leading to actions that right the wrongs of racism and white supremacy that grips the United States and paralyzes our ability to see every human being as equal. Lee Chapman is the director of the Voting Rights Program, overseeing projects that advocate voting protections for marginalized people at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference has led the struggle for equal opportunity and social justice for 70 years. Previously, Chapman was Senior Policy Advisor at Let America Vote, where she advised the organization on election law and policy issues at the state and federal levels. Since May 2013, Aaron Sherb has served as the Director of Legislative Affairs at Common Cause, a national nonpartisan organization with 1.2 million members and 30 state chapters. For 50 years, Common Cause has been working to strengthen our democracy by elevating the voices of everyday Americans in politics through lobbying, litigation, and grassroots organizing. In Aaron's role, he helps craft and gain support for pro-democracy efforts, primarily to get big money out of politics, strengthen voting rights, and promote redistricting, ethics, and lobbying reform. Before joining Common Cause, Aaron worked for 3 members of Congress, as well as for several other nonprofits. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, my first question is, let's start with Andre. What is the important thing we can do to advance a more equitable electoral system?
I want to thank FCNL and my dear friend Jose Walsh for inviting me to participate in this evening's conversation. First and foremost is, as a nation beginning to, at some point.
You muted yourself, Andre.
Is to decide that voting is actually a civil right, and not just a privilege, quite frankly. It started out being not just a privilege, but a privilege primarily for, well, it was a privilege for white male property owners. And not only did everyone not have a right to vote, but African Americans, even in being considered as part of the process, as we started as a republic, were not even counted as full people for the entire process. And we've never gotten to understanding and accepting that voting should actually be accessible and available to everyone. And one place to start is HR 1 that the House has, I believe they've actually passed, that is a very holistic, as I would call it, I dream a world of the greatest things that could happen if we were a true, honest democracy, which means just making the vote, the ballot accessible to everyone in a way that makes it easy. I have one example. I was in South Africa when Thabo Mbeki was voted in as president. It was after Mandela's first term. And I literally, I spent the day traveling all over Port Elizabeth primarily, and in the rural areas, watching people line up. I mean, they had voting for several days. They had special days for people with disabilities, special designated times and places for the elderly. It's amazing how the United States will go all over the world to be observers and to protect the vote for people in other parts of the world when we have yet to be able to, we have yet to decide that our vote actually should be valued and accessible. And maybe we need to have international observers.
Great. Happy to turn that over to the other panelists if they'd like to respond.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. And I just wanted to, kind of set the scene by just saying how right now we're in a moment of reckoning for our nation. And it's a moment that calls for the voices of marginalized people to be louder than ever. Right now I feel like, voting is not going to magically change and solve all of our country's issues, but it's a necessary and critical action that we all must take to wield our power. I know this movie was shot in 2018. But now that we have COVID-19, the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and growing protests over police brutality and state violence against Black Americans really presents unique challenges to holding an election. And while these are unprecedented times, states are really falling really short of fulfilling their obligation to ensure that every voter can cast a ballot that counts. As we saw in Georgia 2 weeks ago now, scenes at polling places have been pure chaos. We've seen lack of social distancing, safety measures. There's voter confusion due to last minute polling place consolidations. People in Georgia stood in line for 7 hours just to cast their ballot. And those were just the people who could, afford to stand in line that long. There were machine breakdowns, there were a shortage of poll workers and ballot problems. And so right now, the most important thing for viewers to do is demand that we have safe, secure, and accessible elections this year, and demand that Congress appropriate at least $3.6 billion to make that happen in the HEROES Act, along with strong policy reforms. We need to have vote by mail in every state. We need to have at least 2 weeks of early voting. We need to have expanded voter registration. Voters should have all the options available this year while we're dealing with this pandemic to cast their ballot. So, I would say the most important thing is to advocate for your senator to pass the HEROES Act so we can have safe and accessible elections this year. And then the second thing I would say is to call on your Secretary of State, your governor, to make sure that we're having expanded accessible options for voters this year.
And I'll just dovetail on both of those great points, and just to echo co-panelists, thank you again to FCNL and to Diane and Jose for convening this extremely important panel and discussion this evening. Now, I think this is really part of a national conversation. Voting, voter suppression did not just happen during the COVID pandemic. It really started in the early 2010s, really widespread, and the Shelby versus Holder decision, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in 2013, really unleashed a national wave of voter suppression tactics. And I think the COVID pandemic really exacerbated, or really, it's obviously awful enough when certain states and localities are trying to suppress the vote under normal circumstances. But when you see, Georgia, when you see Wisconsin, intentionally discriminating against communities of color, making it that much harder to vote for communities of color, it's just that much more appalling during this pandemic. And so, as Lee and Andrea mentioned, passing the HEROES Act with $3.6 billion of election funding for states and localities to expand vote by mail, to expand no excuse absentee voting, to expand early voting, online voter registration, same day registration, automatic voter registration, just kind of giving states an all of the above options for how to use this funding is critically important. As well as Andrea mentioned, passing the For the People Act, HR 1, which the House did in fact pass last March, which would make a huge difference in expanding the right to vote for many communities, as well as passing HR 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which our organizations have collectively done a ton of great work on, but which again, Leader McConnell in the Senate continues to block any progress, any hearings, any vote, any debate in the Senate on that. So I think passing those would make a huge difference in stopping some of these voter suppression tactics that are going on in certain states and localities around the country.
Great, thank you. What is your organization doing to advance election integrity? And this time we can start with Lee.
Sure. So the Leadership Conference is the nation's largest civil rights coalition. We're a diverse coalition with over 220 organizations that are members. We have the Voting Rights Task Force, where all the members, including Common Cause, Jose, everybody comes together to advocate to make sure that we have free, fair, and accessible elections. So the main thing we're doing right now is to just make sure that voters have safe and accessible elections during COVID-19. So supporting HEROES. We're also supporting the HR 4, as Aaron mentioned, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Just to note, next week is the 7th anniversary of that terrible court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, which really, as Aaron said, unleashed a tidal wave of voter suppression across the country, not just in states in the South, as we know. So we have been advocating to restore the Voting Rights Act. And we were successful in the House. We had about a dozen hearings last year, but as Aaron said, McConnell has done nothing. And we're also working in the states. We're supporting organizations in the states that are working to expand the right to vote, to fight voter suppression, to make sure that every voter can cast their ballot. Right now, things are changing so rapidly. Primaries are postponed, and states, a lot of organizations in our coalition are litigating. They're suing states to make sure that voting is more accessible. So for instance, a lot of states require you to have an excuse or a reason to vote by mail. It's not available to everyone. So a lot of organizations in our coalition are suing states to make it more accessible. So we're supporting efforts on the ground just to make sure that everyone has the ability to vote this year.
I guess, to Jose's question, I guess 2 points. So Common Cause has three-pronged approach. We do lobbying, litigation, and grassroots organizing. And so one of our election protection efforts is helping to recruit, train staff, get poll monitors to serve at polling locations to make sure that people who are going to do in-person voting are able to cast their ballot, to make sure their voice can be counted and heard. So that's a huge part of it. We also do tons of grassroots organizing, as does the Leadership Conference and does the National Council of Churches. And so we see this as being critically important to get the $3.6 billion in additional election funding. So, continuing to, yes, it's critically important to get Senate Republicans to agree to additional election funding. We have a list of, especially if you live in one of a handful of states, about 6 or 7 states, Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, Maine, North Carolina, Georgia, 1 or 2 others. Those are key Republican senators in those states who could really make a difference in trying to get additional election funding. So I think, contacting your Senate Republican offices in those states it would be a very strong step in the next few weeks or so, because we expect the Senate to take up the HEROES Act in probably mid-July or so. Negotiations will really get underway in probably mid-July. So sometime in the next couple weeks really is a critically important time to do that.
And thank you guys. Also, with the National Council of Churches is organization has the 38-member communion. We call them denominations. Most people would consider them. We are also members of the Leadership Conference and work closely on a variety of issues. But one of the things that we do, because we're mostly a grass tops organization in the way that we engage, the highest ranking individual for all of these denominations are members of our board. And then we engage their policy staff. So on an issue like voting rights, we have kind of a two-prong approach. We do the lobbying in the advocacy in DC, working in partnership with our colleagues who have more grassroots organizing taking place in the states. So for instance, it has not been unusual for something like if there's a state issue, for instance, that the Leadership Conference is working on in this area, and they might reach out to us and say, we're trying to find someone in this state from the faith, under NCC umbrella, Christian organization, can you help us? And so that's one way we're communicating. The other thing we do is try to educate our constituents, and we do those things by way of webinars and so forth. So in 2018, for instance, we did a series on things like know your rights, who to reach out to, and we'll have a list of resources. The Lawyers Committee, for instance, is also a good organization that has a slew of information around voting rights in particular. So those are the primary ways that we work, and we work with our communion partners. So many of our partners, like the denomination and United Church of Christ, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion, United Methodist, they'll have various things, direct resources that they're providing for their constituency groups, and we elevate that information so that they're sharing, and it's not just for them, but also for the larger NCC community. And we do that both ecumenically and interfaith.
Great, thank you. Now our next question, are there other places or tactics threatening the right to vote? And this time we can start with Aaron.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, President Trump himself, yesterday he happened to tell the truth again and said kind of the quiet part out loud when he said that he needs fewer people to vote in order to win in November. And so I think voter suppression starts, it's not only a state and local effort, but it also starts at the very top of this administration. And so President Trump signaling that he is opposed to vote by mail, signaling that he does not want all eligible Americans to have their voices heard and votes counted, I think sends a very chilling effect. And whereas there are actually, there are a few decent state Republican elected officials, elections officials, Kim Wyman, Washington Secretary of State, the Iowa Secretary of State, a handful of others, I think in Ohio as well, are somewhat trying to do the right thing. They want to try to make sure that all their eligible voters in their states can have many options to have their voices heard and votes counted this November and to cast votes safely. But when President Trump uses his bully pulpit to try to diminish or try to sow discord about vote by mail, or try to mention completely unfounded voter fraud instances that vote by mail could lead to, even though he himself has voted by mail, as has Vice President Pence, as have many members of the current administration. It just sends a very chilling effect around the country. It makes it that much harder for advocates and elected officials to want to do the right thing to make sure that all people can cast their votes safely this year.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think what Aaron described is misinformation and disinformation, and we're hearing it from the president. But another very real threat is misinformation, disinformation, and voter suppression content on social media platforms. We started seeing that in 2016 when there was a concerted effort by foreign actors to suppress the vote of people of color online. And honestly, between 2016 and 2020, the platforms have not done enough to prevent it from happening again this year. The Leadership Conference and our coalition, we've been advocating and pushing for the platforms to adopt expansive voter suppression policies to prevent it, but they just haven't done enough. So I know we, along with Common Cause, Election Protection, and others, have set up monitoring efforts to make sure that when we do see suppressive content online, it's being reported. We're reporting it directly to the platforms, and we're also getting information out to our coalition on how to respond. So that's happening right now. And, I know there was an announcement earlier this week that Facebook has now, they have a new election center with registration information about vote by mail, information about where to find your polling place, which is all wonderful. And it's something that we've been pushing on them to do for years. So we're excited that they're doing that, but they still have not done enough to prevent voter suppression. So that's a continued push that we're advocating for.
Aaron and Lee have really addressed kind of like immediate issues. I just want to bring up the importance of us continually, how we continue to work on this. So for instance, the census now will impact voting in the future. And people can still do their census, and they need to. And it has an impact on issues like gerrymandering, which isn't gonna make a difference coming up in November, but it does in the future. And the way the census, and then the way it's used against people, or I should say impacting our communities moving forward, one area in particular, or two, is this concept that known as pack and crack, where you pack certain communities or types of individuals within a particular district, which has an impact on their ability to have an impact actually in a larger way in the Electoral College, for instance. And the other is to crack. And so the region or the district being structured in a way that it's, and the whole thing about a salamander like this way, it has it has a strange shape, which is part of the way the name comes about, because they just draw these districts in a way that you're going to decide we'll put a handful of people of this type in this area, put a few in this, and you kind of crack up or break up any kind of concentration and the impact that they can have. So the census is the beginning of how that later has an impact. So we need to work on what we're going to do to vote now, but also paying attention to and laying a foundation for communities to impact how they'll have a voice in the future.
Great, thank you for those thoughtful responses. Now, my last question, and many of you have already touched on this, but I think it would bear repeating. What are 2 or 3 things we can do to advance the right to vote and push back against voter suppression?
I'll start, I think, because I think these guys have I think education, I'm just always believing that people need to understand and know more. some of the things really, checking your registration ahead of time with all of the suppression efforts. And I know it's frustrating. Here in DC, I stood in line for 3.5 hours to vote. And I still don't understand why. Well, maybe it had to do with the social distancing and all that, but I still can't understand. In my area, I could usually go and I get in and out within 15, 20 minutes. So that was just really surprising. But checking registration, checking your polling place well ahead of time, given where we are right now and whatever the state's ruling is going to be about access given COVID, find out what the rules are around early voting and accessing absentee ballots. Working with organizations and groups that are doing this work already, which our partners here are part of those, for instance. Fair Fight, I'm not sure if that was mentioned in the film that Stacey Abrams' organization has started, but there are others that are nationwide that have state-by-state things that they're doing. And then I think of the way, I think of how we get involved as what I call protest policy and polling in the polls. So the issues that are important to you, ensuring that as you're looking at how to get engaged, find organizations that are engaged in those issues. And often they're also going to be both educational as well as in many cases having a get out the vote kind of campaign. So I just encourage people to also get involved. And if you're in one of those areas, and if you're one of the people that's not really quote unquote targeted in a way to suppress your vote, be an advocate for the people who you know who are being targeted. So those are, that's just kind of a larger concepts, but.
Yeah, and I would just, I have a few points as far as what people can do to advance the right to vote and fight voter suppression. The first thing, register and vote, and to make sure your friends and family are registered as well. And then I would say then actually vote. And remember that election officials work for you and you have the power. The third thing is to contact your senators and demand that they pass the HEROES Act to make sure that we have fair, safe, and accessible elections in November. And the fourth thing is, at the leadership conference, we launched a campaign called And Still I Vote. And this is a campaign we launched on the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. And the whole point of the campaign is to shine a light on voter suppression, shine a light on everything that you saw in the movie, and then to mobilize people to take action to fight against it. So if you're interested in joining the Army to fight voter suppression, I would encourage you to go to our website, which is at andstillivote.org. And I can also put in the chat box. And then I just want to underscore Andrea's point that she mentioned earlier, with so much at stake right now, just remember to fill out your census form if you haven't done so far, because each person who's counted also builds political power.
Completely agree with everything that Andrea and Lee have said, and just underscore the importance of making sure that everybody is registered to vote. There are some states still that are trying to do voter purges. So just if you might not have voted in the last election or two, just double check your voter registration on your state voter registration website. Double check. It's a good reason, especially during this pandemic. Touch base with your family, your friends, your colleagues around the country, make sure that they are still registered, and just encourage them to vote, because there's certainly, I think a kind of a social impact as well, or just kind of a social pressure to encourage everybody, whether it's texting or calling them or emailing them. I think just those constant reminders can really make a big difference, and that just can be magnified around the country.
Great, thank you for those thoughtful questions. Well, those thoughtful responses to my questions. We're now going to transition to questions from the audience. Remember to submit your questions through the chat function. We might not have time to get through all of the questions today, but that's why we hope that this will be the beginning of the discussion and you will continue this work with us after the session ends today. So the first question, the film can be seen as a slam dunk indictment of voter suppression in Georgia. Are the defenders of these governmental actions able to state any reasonable and believable points? And if so, can you restate them? I need to know how to effectively address and counter their concerns.
I don't know if I understand. I'm not sure I got the question. Can you say that again?
To rephrase it, I think that he's asking these people who are suppressing the vote in Georgia, what are they saying? And just to understand if there are any reasonable or believable points that they're making so that we can address them and counter them.
I think we're all quiet because we don't think that there are any reasonable arguments to suppress the vote. But I mean, some things that vote suppressors say is that they're trying to fight voter fraud. That's one thing they try to say, which, as we all know, voter fraud is very extremely rare. Rare, and when it does happen, it's caught. So that's one argument they make. You know, the leadership conference, we wrote a whole report about polling place closures, and we found that there were over 1,600 polling places closed in many of the southern states since the Shelby case. And a lot of officials have said that they closed polling places because to save money, right? Or, you know, different reasons like that. But I feel like there's really no price to have an inclusive democracy. Like, we shouldn't be trying to close polling places and make it harder for people to vote you know, it just doesn't make any sense because that's when you have the 7-hour lines and things like that. So those are the arguments that we hear often.
Yeah, and I think that one of the others is the having some form of ID, and then what's determined a valid ID and what's not. And I mean, it's hard to, I think the question is a difficult one because they actually will say things that are like, oh, that kind of makes sense. And it's like, but it didn't make sense before 2010. It wasn't necessary before when there was a large number of people who had registered to vote and things turned out in a way that, you know, people didn't believe that they didn't care for or like. So as Lee said, and the issue is whether or not people are going to believe what the real facts are. And I think that's the difficulty as well. There really is no history of substantial voter fraud in the United States. None. I think if I remember correctly, and you guys might know the facts more, but I think it was under President George Bush, that they did a huge study, and I mean looked at like millions of ballots and found like, I don't know, like less than 100 examples of any kind of attempt to fraud. And so it's really as people would say, they're creating a problem to support, quite frankly, as Aaron said earlier, which the president admitted to, the more people vote, if the more people who have an opportunity to vote, statistically, according to him and others, Democrats do better. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I do believe that people should just be allowed to vote. And voter ID is one of those things that they do that it does not usually have any valid reason for science and evidence to support it. And the moving of purging of your voting list as well is usually very unfair in how it's done. Even when they use IDs, you're only allowing certain IDs to be used. I mean, imagine being in a place that a college ID is not acceptable, but your gun registration ID is. So some of it is, in some cases, it might even be what some would say common sense. But it's also difficult to convince people who have decided that they're going to do a certain thing to persuade them.
I just add to that point that, as Ray's mentioned, voter fraud is extremely rare. I think you have a greater chance of getting struck by lightning than having voter fraud impact the results of an election. So there are certain Republicans, just to be blunt, who continue to try to invoke or scare people into voter fraud, that it's rampant, it's all over the country, and that we need to pass voter ID laws, that we need to shut down polling locations. But it's there's scant evidence, there's next to no examples of this, and so it seems it's mostly just a scare tactic to try to continue to suppress the vote and restrict access to the ballot.
Great, thank you. So mail-in ballots, do they risk not being counted in the way provisional ballots were in the video?
I think that gets to a key point about the importance of the USPS, about the importance of the Postal Service. In the HEROES Act, there's additional investments for the Postal Service to make sure that it is solvent beyond September. So I think, to make sure that everybody who wants to vote by mail is able to, I think you can check the status of your mail-in ballot in many cases. You can see when it's been mailed. You can kind of check the status of it in many states. You can check to see when it's been received. It's got a bar tracking code on the outside. So I think there's certainly ways to make sure that that your voice is in fact being heard and your vote counted through mail-in ballots. And as we all know, that's going to be a critically important option for many Americans this year. And so, some people can vote by mail. That doesn't work for every community. There are certain transient communities, certain Native populations who don't have fixed addresses or that are kind of current with the USPS postal system kind of address system. So mail-in ballots don't work for everybody, but it's certainly an important option, and we think that certainly has a critical role to play.
Yeah, I agree with what Aaron said. Vote by mail is something we need, especially in this pandemic. Every voter should be mailed at least an application to vote by mail. But as he said, it doesn't work for everybody. So that's why we're advocating for all of the options. So in addition to vote by mail, we need to have the 2 weeks of early voting. We need to have safe in-person voting this year. But I also I've been telling everybody this who will listen, is we all have to get comfortable with the fact that we're not going to know who has won the presidency on November 3rd because of mail voting. It's going to take time for jurisdictions to count ballots. We might not know for another week or so after the election. And that doesn't mean that fraud is happening. It just means that the process is playing out. We need to ensure that every vote is counted. So this is a new normal we're going to have to live with as more jurisdictions move to absentee voting. And I know we were talking a little bit about fraud, but 5 states have been implementing all vote by mail elections for a long time. Vote by mail is safe. It doesn't necessarily help one political party over the other, and it doesn't invite fraud. So.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Tammy. Are the purges still happening? What can be done to prevent them?
So I guess the short answer is yes, there are certain states that are still trying to purge voters, unfortunately. There are also lawsuits or threatened lawsuits from certain outside kind of special interests, if you will, that are trying to force state elections officials to purge voters. So I think the most important thing to do to try to counteract these is to, to help publicize this issue, to help enlarge this issue so that more people know about it in one state or locality, and just as simple as writing a letter to the editor or having a compelling story. For example, there's a Supreme Court case called Husted versus APRI. There was a mayor of a fairly small town in Ohio who's a veteran who had returned from overseas, found out that he had been purged from the voting rolls there because he had not voted when he'd been serving our country overseas. So using compelling stories like those individuals to help elevate the issue, to get some media attention, I think those can be extremely powerful to help shift public opinion. So the public can really see through what the voter purges are trying to accomplish. And that's really to restrict voting access to fewer and fewer people.
Yeah, and I would just, to add to what Aaron said, I think the best remedy to stop purges is for states to adopt same-day voter registration. And that's something that we've all been advocating for. It's in HR 1, and we're also pushing, that's also in HEROES. It's the best way if people are, usually when people are purged, they don't know until they show up to the polling place on election day and they realize they're not on the rolls, and then they're given a provisional ballot, which many times doesn't count if they're not in the rolls. So that's why if you can push in your state to adopt same-day voter registration, it's so critical. And also for people to, check their voter registration now. We still have about 5 months to the election. So people need to just stay on it, and especially in states like Georgia and Ohio that have these use it or lose it purge practices where they kick voters off the rolls for not voting for a certain number of years. So I would just encourage you to tell your friends and family to just check their voter registration status.
Great, thank you. Next question is the motive for voter suppression motivated more by partisan politics, parentheses GOP, than racism?
Yes. I know that even just, I think that what we have seen over the years, each party does do the gerrymandering thing, when they get into office, and that's a whole nother issue. But a lot of, if you look at the primary ways in which voter suppression has taken place with the voter IDs, in many places where this is taking place, the IDs, Black people, brown people, as we said, other people of color, and quite frankly, elderly and many college students now are also targeted for some voter suppression tactics. And I would ask if Lee and Aaron, because of the work they're doing specifically in different areas, if they have seen it differently. But what I've understood, at one point, I remember telling someone that I could, if you gave me 3 things that were taking place in a particular community, state, and that was voter suppression, rolling back women's rights, and issues around immigration, I could tell you quite frankly, which political party was in charge, because they all went hand in hand. And that's what the facts laid out.
Yeah, I would just say it's a combination. It's, there's so much systemic issues with voter suppression in our country. Like Andrea mentioned, we've never had an inclusive democracy where everyone can participate. Voting rates are usually around like 40%. in our country. You know, there's still so many people who don't participate, and a lot of people who want to but can't, and they're just shut out of the process. And many of those people are people of color, people who are older, low income, students, you know, people who have limited English proficiency. So, and I feel like, you know, there are people in power who want to keep that power, and they know what tactics and tricks to play to make it harder for people to vote. So it's a combination of, I think, racism and also keeping that political power or trying to take it away.
Great, thank you. Let me just go for our next question. So lots of questions from people who live in places where voter suppression isn't as prevalent or at least visible. They would like to know what they can do and what states in particular they should focus on.
I guess, you know, if you have friends or family or, you know, colleagues who live in other states where it is more prevalent or where there are key Republican senators who could help make a difference to help pass the $3.6 billion in additional investments in state and local election funding, you know, contact them in Arizona, in Colorado, in Iowa, Maine, North Carolina, you know, Georgia, Montana, you know, one or two others, and just, you know, make sure that they can write to their senators. You could even draft a, you know, an email for them, you know, just 3 or 4 sentence email to them and say, hey, could you contact your Republican senator and ask him or her to support $3.6 billion in additional election funding for states in the upcoming HEROES Act. Yeah, that can be extremely effective as well. So that's I think that's one key point.
Okay, next question. Aaron, you mentioned voting monitors. But how can these monitors actually stop fraudulent practices if they witness them? Isn't it too late at that point?
I think there's some, for example, there was a voter in, you know, Common Cause and the Lawyers Committee, for Civil Rights, and others help run an 866 Our Vote hotline. So we help on primary election days and as well as general election days. We help you know, staff those hotlines as well as having poll monitors throughout the country in key states and localities. And so, you know, for example, there's in primary earlier this year in one state where in-person voting, a voter was told that he needed to have a voter ID in order to vote. Yeah, I think it probably wasn't nefarious. I think it was just, you know, incorrect information from somebody, a poll worker there. So one of our poll monitors was able to help correct that and make sure that person did not need to show an ID to vote and did not have to cast a provisional ballot like the poll worker had said this person would if he couldn't produce a voter ID. So I think, you know, that's an example of, you know, it's not something that's nefarious. It's just kind of, you know, just uninformed poll worker who didn't know that that there'd been litigation in that state that had thrown out the voter ID law. So I think, you know, that's an example of where poll monitors can actually make a difference right then and there.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, you can help monitor in advance of election day. So election officials are now making decisions for November. So they're deciding where to locate polling places, where to locate voting centers, how many they're going to close down, how many poll workers they're going to have. You know, you can, there's a lot of poll workers shortages, especially now with COVID-19. So, I mean, people are going to vote in person. So, you know, if you can also sign up to be a poll worker. So there's a lot of work that can be done also between now and election day to make sure that voting is accessible. So attending those election official meetings where those decisions are happening are critical as well.
I was going to say too, in addition to the organizations that are present, organizations like the NAACP and Others usually have people who are on site, especially in highly contested elections and when in areas where there's going to be a problem, where people believe there will be a problem. They're not always there, but just being aware that these things exist. And so if you don't see it, you can look it up, for instance. If it's not right there, to know that there is, for instance, Common Cause or Lawyers Committee, NAACP, and others that'll have resources that are available for what you do on the ground, but also doing what can be done earlier. And even the film showed how the community took it upon themselves to make a difference. I mean, when they decided that they confronted the issue and ended up preventing them from moving that polling place was one thing I could say too about activism. It's amazing when you realize your power. There really is power in your role as a active citizen, because you're the boss. So those phone calls, the emails, Twitter, texting, the people who are responsible for these various things, be it the city council level or the mayor, or if it's a statewide issue with your state, your governor or secretary of state, as well as your congressional representatives in DC. It matters when you believe me, when they hear from you. It may seem like they're not paying attention, but if enough people are contacting them, all of a sudden you see some change.
Great.
I'll say, just to echo Andrea, numbers matter. They're next to nobody is saying, members of Congress are not getting tons of emails or phone calls saying, suppress the vote on your polling locations. It's largely a very small number of people who, and special interest groups and self-interested elected officials who are making those decisions to restrict voting. So if you can generate 10, 50, 100, 1,000 emails, phone calls, letters to the editor, social media posts directed at a member of Congress with his or her name always included in it, that definitely matters. That is critically important, even if they don't respond.
Great. So Aaron, you mentioned target senators for the HEROES Act. Could you please repeat those states, please?
Yes, and I put them in the chat farther up, but I know I read those fast before, and I can put those in there again. And these are the ones that Common Cause has been focusing our grassroots energy on, based on where we have the most number of supporters. So other groups might differ a little bit, but for the most part, these are some of the kind of the key vulnerable Republican senators where we've focused our email and letters to the editor and phone calls. But it's Arizona, Martha McSally, Colorado, Cory Gardner, Iowa, Joni Ernst, Maine, Susan Collins, Montana, Steve Daines, North Carolina, Tom Tillis, and just recently after the Georgia primary, Senator Perdue from Georgia. And I will put those in the chat as well. They're all senators to varying degrees, and we think that Senator McConnell, Majority Leader McConnell, would most listen to them if they are getting flooded with thousands of phone calls and emails from their constituents saying, demanding that we get more election funding for this November.
Great, thank you. Now, our last question. For those of us who are hoping to convince our family and friends to vote, especially in light of voter suppression and feeling like our vote doesn't count, what advice would you give to those hoping to motivate friends and family?
Sure. I always say, connect it to the issues. We're seeing so much happen in our country right now, and we can't get the change that we want unless people vote. So if the person you're talking about cares about police brutality issues, bring that up. If it's education, if it's healthcare, if it's immigrants' rights, we just had two great Supreme Court decisions this week, which was shocking, but the next person who was elected probably will have another Supreme Court seat. So, you just have to make the tie to what's relevant to them, put it in their interest, but always connect it to issues. Because that's what's going to keep people standing in line for those hours, is if they know that, their vote has a direct impact on a particular issue they care about.
I agree with Lee. One of the things that I had someone say that I thought was really interesting too, in the African American community, people would always say, people died so that you could vote. And their response was, you need to vote so that people can live. Because the vote does matter on policies and issues that are life and death. And literally life and death, but also quality of life, sustainability. So, and it's the same thing that Leah's saying around connecting it to an issue, but it's not just that you have to vote because people sacrifice so that you could vote, but your vote actually is to keep life from having to be one, in which one is sacrificing just to live.
And I would just echo both those great points, and also just say how critically important it is to connect the dots between voting rights and any other kind of kitchen table issue, if you will. We're extremely unlikely to be able to solve our broken immigration system or anti-gun violence or high cost of prescription drugs unless we vote. And so just helping to connect the dots between the importance of voting and each of those issues, because I think, sometimes voting can seem abstract or it seems kind of philosophical, but I think, connecting the votes, like if we want to lower prescription drug costs, we have to vote and have our voices heard. I think that can help resonate with people and meet people with where they are about an issue that they care about the most.
So thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for offering their wisdom on this really important pivotal issue. And again, thank you for joining us, and remember to go to our action page to advocate that Congress appropriate $3.6 billion to states for their electoral systems to be safe and equitable. You'll receive that action alert in your inboxes shortly. We also have an action alert for the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is HR 4. This is a very important piece of legislation that can help us push back against voter suppression. And again, thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Be safe, everyone.
Have a great weekend.